All right. Unless Don or Tate tells me otherwise, I think we'll get the meeting started then. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim Olthoff. I am right now performing the duties of the Undersecretary of Commerce for Standards and Technology and as the Director of NIST. So I'm ready today in accordance with the Help America Vote Act, and as the Director of NIST, I'm honored to serve as the Chairman of the Technical Guidelines Development Committee. So welcome to our web meeting. It's too bad we can't all meet in person, but it's nice that we have the technologies to have a meeting like this, even during very challenging times. So I want to say congratulations on the approval of the VBSG 2.0 earlier this year. I have to acknowledge this group's commitment and contributions to assisting to get the VBSG 2.0 across the finish line. Your valuable insights, feedback, the perseverance it took continue to help improve the state of election systems. The new VBSG 2.0 requirements are the path to replace decades-old voting machines and to incorporate modern usability, accessibility, system, and security practices. So today's meeting will touch base on current program updates, next steps in the VBSG 2.0 implementation process. We'll address technologies outside of the VBSG, and we'll receive a briefing on the executive order focused on promoting access to voting. More specifically, within the agenda, the EAC will share updates on their testing and certification program and the VBSG 2.0 lifecycle policy. At your last meeting, you discussed a desire for guidelines on additional election systems. So today we'll hear an update on the ePoll book pilot, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on additional priorities. So NIST will share updates on the National Voluntary Laboratory Accreditation Program, or NAVLAP as we call it. NIST will also update you on our implementation guidance for the VBSG 2.0 and our current work on Executive Order 14109, promoting access to voting. And finally, NIST will brief you on the election infrastructure subsector joint working group efforts to develop cybersecurity framework election profiles. The EAC and NIST are having discussions about the path forward on the E2E protocol evaluation process, and we'll share more about the draft process and potential timelines. In particular, we're looking forward to your feedback in several critical areas: the VBSG 2.0 lifecycle policy, the E2E protocol evaluation process and timeline, the proposed methodology used for the ePoll book pilot program, and lastly, leveraging of the cybersecurity framework profiles to manage cybersecurity risks in election systems. So I think we're all looking forward to fruitful discussions this afternoon. Once again, I want to thank you for your time, your dedication to improving our nation's election systems. So next, we'll have introductory remarks from EAC's designated federal officer for the TGDC, Commissioner Don Palmer. Don.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Olthoff. Good afternoon. I'm U.S. Election Assistance Commission Chairman Don Palmer. I'm serving as the designated federal officer for the Technical Guidelines Development Committee, or the TGDC. I want to welcome everyone to today's TGDC board meeting. The meeting, which is called pursuant to the Federal Advisory Committee Act, has been noticed in the Federal Register and published on the EAC website. This meeting is open to the public, and I want to welcome all of those who have joined us virtually. The TGDC is a 15-member advisory committee established by the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA, to assist the EAC in development of the voluntary voting system guidelines. Pursuant to HAVA, the director of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, serves as the chair of the TGDC. HAVA also requires NIST to provide the TGDC with the technical support necessary to carry out its duties. This is our first TGDC meeting since our February 10th commissioner vote that moved to adopt the VBSG 2.0. I'm pleased that we can move on beyond the discussions of the requirements and instead focus on steps toward operationalizing VBSG 2.0. Today, we'll see presentations on the EAC testing and certification program, the NIST voting program, the VBSG lifecycle policy, and the end-to-end encryption process. In addition, we'll also be presenting an ePoll book evaluation pilot program. While HAVA mandates that the EAC develop and maintain the VBSG requirements, it will be evident today that this effort requires the election community to work together as a whole to make VBSG 2.0 a reality. For example, the lifecycle policy on deprecation of obsolete standards is a balancing act in an uncertain market. There is a cross current of forces, many outside our control, that create challenges to a streamlined implementation of 2.0. We'll be listening very closely because that balance is similar to many of the challenges you have to manage at the state and local level. As a member, you have the expertise to identify the technical challenges ahead of us with these new standards. I'm asking everyone on this board to put your thinking cap on and advise the EAC on how to navigate this process to ensure it is a smooth as possible process over the next election cycle or two. And remember, this is not a one-time call for your advice, but rather a continuous commitment to the implementation of VBSG 2.0. Despite the requirements being voluntary, at least 38 states use the standards, making the February 10th vote on advancing those next versions of the VBSG very important. We're reaching a point in election administration that almost every voting machine deployed by the vendors has been tested and certified under EAC accredited labs or the VBSG. So there are a number of technical issues to discuss regarding the practical implementation timeline for the new standards, along with how we intelligently deprecate the VBSG 1.0 standard to maintain the existing standard systems in the field. What security updates and bug fixes are needed, how to narrow the definition of allowable changes in the future. The path to certification of systems to old standards may narrow substantially just 24 months after the first BISTL is accredited to 2.0. Another part of the lifecycle policy that needs your review is the review and update process in that document that you have. The goal here is to have an agile and flexible process. This process starts with the yearly report by the EAC staff to the executive director on any potential changes, a 12-month cycle, and a permanent or prominent role of the TGDC to make the determination when to move on the update for minor or major changes to 2.0. The TGDC will play a primary role because it will advise and coordinate with the EAC and NIST on when to launch the process that will result in the initiation of minor or major changes to VBSG 2.0. On the implementation of VBSG 2.0, the EAC, NIST, our labs, and our boards have continued to move the process forward on parallel paths during the last several months. A lot of work has been done over the years to get us to this point. For that reason, I want to thank TGDC and NIST for all their efforts to date. I know there are a lot of details to discuss, but let's not forget that VBSG 2.0 represents a significant advancement in defining standards that will serve as a cornerstone of the next generation of voting systems. It lays the groundwork for 21st century voting systems that will fill a desperately needed role in improving cybersecurity, accessibility, and usability requirements. In addition, we have also published an update to the VBSG 2.0 test assertions that will include items like familiar methods for hardware testing. These updates will be continuous as we work through the implementation of 2.0. So now let's shift to the development and testing of election systems related to the voting process. These systems are more vulnerable to outside intrusion, and frankly, we need to raise the level of security. The EAC is in the nascent stages of creating a new voluntary e-poll book program that will include key elements such as the requirements and responsibilities for participation in the program, manufacturer registration, a quality monitoring program, and testing and reporting procedures. The requirements will be developed and published similar to the VBSG, but with a narrower scope. They will focus on unique aspects of e-poll books that related to security, usability, and accessibility. The testing will be conducted by EAC accredited VISTLs. Test plan reports and relevant attachments will be posted on the EAC website and will include typical system configuration information like software versions, hardware used, and hashes. You'll hear more about the pilot later in the meeting. So I believe I'm required to take the roll, and so how about we go down the participant list, and those joining by phone or joining late can announce themselves at the end. I'm actually going to pull up what I have here is a list. Let's make sure we do this before we get too far into this. So I noted we do have Chairman James. So Chairman Althoff.
Here.
Sorry to make you repeat that. Robert Giles.
Here.
Paul Lux.
Here.
Linda Lamone.
Here.
Shane Scholler.
Here.
Mark Guthrie.
Here.
Pat Cannon. Mary Saunders.
Here.
Dan Wallach.
Here.
Lori Angino.
Good morning, I'm here.
Morning. Joe Cho.
Here.
McDermott Coots.
Here.
Diane Golden.
Here.
David Wagner.
Here.
Jeff Hale.
Here.
Thank you. So at this point, I guess I turn it over to, I want to thank again everyone who's going to be presenting today. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions. I'll pass this on to the EAC General Counsel, Kevin Rayburn, and he'll provide us a reminder of the meeting procedures and any other relevant info. Kevin, are you available?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Palmer. My name is Kevin Rayburn, General Counsel for the EAC, and I'm going to give some further background on the TGDC, its operations, and the conduct of meetings. First, I would like to welcome the 3 newest members of the TGDC, who I believe this is their first meeting: Shane Scholler, Pat Cannon, and Jeff Hale. So the TGDC, the Technical Guidelines Development Committee, is a federal advisory committee. And that means it is a advisor committee that provides non-binding advice to a federal agency, in this case, the Election Assistance Commission, and is subject to the Federal Advisory Committee Act. You will often hear this law called FACA. So FACA is the Federal Advisory Committee Act, and boards and committees subject to FACA are often called FACA boards. The EAC has 4 FACA boards: the TGDC, the Board of Advisors, and the Standards Boards. The Standards Board are FACA boards that are established by statute. They are established by Congress through the Help America Vote Act of 2002. The 4th FACA board was established by the EAC itself this year, and it is called the Local Leadership Council, and it's made up, its members are local election officials. So Section 221 of the Help America Vote Act lays out the structure of the TGDC and its authority. As already stated, it says that the chairman of the TGDC and a member is the director of NIST. It also sets forth 14 other members coming from different organizations and authorizes the appointment of technical experts. There are 4 different types of membership to a federal advisory committee and to the TGDC. The first is referred to as an ex officio member. And so this is where, for example, a statute will say a position in federal government is a member. In our case, the director of NIST is an ex officio member by whoever holds that position, and that title steps in as a member and as chairman. The next type of membership is a representative member. Most of our federal advisory committees, the members are representative members, and that means they are representing an organization or a body. So they're not bringing just their own experiences and views, they're bringing the greater experiences and backgrounds of that body. The third type of membership is called a special government employee. Usually technical experts fall within this category. For ethics and conflicts purposes, they are considered federal employees. So they are subject to conflicts of interest laws. And they cannot serve more than 130 days a year serving the federal government. The 4th category is regular government employees. And these are folks who serve more than 130 days or full-time employees of the federal government who also happen to serve on a federal advisory committee. So HAVA lays forth the core duty of the TGDC, and that is to assist the executive director of the EAC in the development of the voluntary voting system guidelines. That's in section 221 of HAVA. And the executive director is to take into account those recommendations that are provided by the TGDC when he or she ultimately recommends VBSG to the full EAC commission. Now, FACA boards, including the TGDC, are subject to open records laws. So communication between TGDC members and between TGDC members and staff of the EAC are likely subject to disclosure if there was a FOIA request. So always keep that in mind when you're communicating on TGDC business, as well as materials and other matters that are presented to the TGDC. The TGDC has a designated federal officer. Every FACA board is required to have a federal advisory, a federal designated officer. In this case, it is EAC Chairman Don Palmer. And we also have an alternate designated federal officer, in our case, John Panic. These are critically important roles. They're necessary roles. Every federal advisory committee has to have them. The DFO has to approve the agenda and approve the date and time of the meetings. And they have to be present for all official business. So if a DFO is not able to be present, the Federal Advisory Committee is not legally allowed to proceed on with business. The main organizing document for the TGDC is its charter. The TGDC charter is adopted by the EAC every 2 years. The TGDC charter sets forth that a quorum is a simple majority of its members. In this case, with a 15-member body, that would be 8 people. And also sets forth that a majority vote is required for resolutions and recommendations from the TGDC to the EAC. Finally, I'll mention that all our federal advisory boards generally follow Robert's Rules of Order. And so that means official business is taken up usually through a motion, which is seconded, and then a majority vote to adopt that motion. It's not uncommon to move things along. You'll see a chairman ask if there is any opposition, and hearing none, the matter would be approved because that would be implying that there was a majority of support. So that is all I had to cover, and I will turn it over to John Panic.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Dr. Olthoff, for the opening remarks, and Chairman Palmer. Let me share my screen real quick here. Tate, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sounds great.
Thank you. All right, good afternoon, good morning, members of the TGDC, depending on your location. Thank you for joining us today. My name is John Panic, and I'm the Testing and Certification Director here at the EAC. For the next couple minutes, I'm going to provide a status brief on significant work happening within the testing and certification program. Most of the recent work since I joined the agency in April has been related to implementation of the VBSG 2.0. So here we have a graphic some of you have probably seen before. This is actually posted on the VBSG page on the EAC website. This is an updated version to show some slight changes to the timelines for some of the tasks as we progress throughout 2021. The first 2 tasks on this graphic, NIST NAVLAP updates and the test lab accreditation, these 2 elements are primary and critical to implementation of the VBSG 2.0. The EAC has been working closely with NAVLAP over the last few months on updates to the 150-22 handbook for lab accreditation. And these are topics that NIST is going to provide some more thorough detail on the status of during their voting program few other essential elements involved in implementing VBSG 2.0. The VBSG lifecycle policy. So last week, the EAC shared a first draft of the VBSG lifecycle policy. That includes guidance to the industry on obsolete VBSG standard deprecation, update cadence, and configuration management of the standards. The last item on the graphic, the EAC approved E2E protocols are a key element in the software independence aspect of VBSG 2.0 and required for paperless implementation. The EAC is currently developing specifications and evaluation criteria for E2E protocols. Once the specifications and the evaluation criteria are published, the protocol evaluation program will be established. Both the VBSG lifecycle policy and the E2E evaluation program are topics that are on today's agenda, and we will be discussing those in greater detail. Next item, I want to briefly mention an update to the VBSG 2.0 test assertions. Many of the VBSG requirements focus on design at a high level. In order to thoroughly test the requirements, manufacturers and the test labs need the ability to break down each VBSG requirement into specific testable conditions. And test assertions are one way to accomplish this. The first version of the test assertions were published on the EAC website, along with the adopted VBSG 2.0 in February. Since then, work has been put into an improved draft of the assertions, which was published on our website in September. We performed a sweep of the test assertions in the initial document against the requirements, and the updated document provides some clarity in some of the requirements where that was lacking in the initial assertion document. We added some test methods for items such as EMC, EMI testing, and environmental testing. And we've removed some assertions that were redundant to the requirements and did not actually provide additional clarity. The intent for the document is to evolve and improve over time. So we expect to publish a few iterations as we progress through implementation of VBSG 2.0. Next, I want to discuss a couple major enhancements to the version 3.0 testing and certification program manuals. Note these manuals aren't yet effective. They will be made effective coinciding with implementation of VBSG 2, which maybe late this year or early next year, it will actually go into effect. Major updates are the component testing pilot program. This is being introduced to facilitate certification of components outside of a full system certification. Vulnerability assessment and penetration testing will be required to be performed before an application for certification of a voting system is approved. This process should effectively mitigate the number of security vulnerabilities in voting systems, as it forces them to be addressed at the front end of all EAC test campaigns. We're also drafting some additional changes to manufacturer agreements that will be added to the manuals here shortly. These changes are to provide the EAC with a greater degree of oversight and transparency. The definition of a manufacturer will be updated to require submission of a voting system for certification within 24 months of application approval. This is to prevent entities that have no intention of producing a legitimate voting system from registering with the EAC. Manufacturers will be required to disclose any essential patent claims to the EAC that would be infringed upon by use, sale, offer for sale, or other disposition of a voting system compliant with the most recently adopted version of the VBSG. Ownership disclosure changes are being made that will reduce that burden from 51 to 25% ownership interests, as well as a direct and indirect ownership is now specified in the manuals. And manufacturers will be required to provide their supply chain risk management strategy, as well as information regarding security testing on voting systems external to the EAC testing and certification program. Lastly, I want to mention a few efforts the EAC and NIST are in the early stages of consideration. Exploring the feasibility of creating a vulnerability database for voting systems, utilizing the NIST National Vulnerability Database. This might look something like a subset of the National Vulnerability Database with its, I believe, over 150,000 vulnerabilities parsed down into a manageable number of items that could be more efficiently and readily used for voting system certification testing. Also establishing vulnerability and threat analysis methodology for voting systems. The potential scope of this methodology could be for both the manufacturers with respect to some of the requirements in VBSG 2.0 Principle 14 for system integrity, as well as for the VISTLs as a guide for phase 1 of the penetration testing required in the new program manuals. So that concludes the testing and certification program updates at this time. Does anybody have any questions or any comments?
Hi, this is Dan Wallach. A quick question about the patent disclosure line. Could you say a little bit more about what that means? Like, is it like what does that mean for them to disclose or not to disclose a patent that relates to the standard?
Yes, just a second. So this does get into some legal wording and the way that it's framed out, but basically the patent claims that are essential to compliance for VBSG requirements. It's something that we want to ensure that the manufacturers are openly providing that information to the EAC. If it has to do with basically
John, I can step in here real quick. It might be helpful.
Sure.
So, good afternoon, everybody. Just wanted to clarify. So we had received a number of concerns regarding the disclosure of patents that are tied to VBSG requirements. And so what we found when we looked into it is we don't really have a part of our program that requires manufacturers to disclose when they have a patent that ties to one of the requirements, which puts the manufacturers in a real scary blind spot when it comes to a potential patent infringement because they don't know what they don't know. So having some edits to enhance our program manual that requires disclosure having to do with patents seems really prudent at this time. We've had a number of manufacturers report this over the years. And we are just performing our due diligence and trying to add this enhancement so that that disclosure is there to avoid a patent infringement and or non-transparency that could result in legal challenges. I hope that answers your question. Sorry, John.
So I guess the concept is that the EAC is helping keep manufacturers' awareness of other competing claims, but the EAC isn't making any statement as to validity or applicability or anything like that.
No, of course not. Not a patent court, not a patent and trademark office either, but definitely realize that there's a real blind spot in there and a number of concerns around the matter with transparency tying to patents that are in place that tie to the requirements. So yep, that's correct.
And this is EAC General Counsel. It's critically important, especially as we're creating modifications to VBSG, that if there is an essential patent out there that a manufacturer has, we need to know during the drafting process while there's an opportunity to kind of address that, let the other manufacturers speak to it. So it really just adds transparency to the process so that if there is a duty for manufacturers to disclose those essential patents that would necessarily be infringed if someone was to build a VBSG compliant system.
Good morning. It's Lori Agino. I have a quick question regarding the timeline, the updated timeline that was presented today. I noticed.
Yes.
I noticed that it said that the completion, I think it said the completion of the work on the life cycle policy would happen in October of 2021. So right now, I'm just curious if you're expecting to have that complete and issued, and if you're expecting any kind of action, formal action to come out of the TGDC today.
So as mentioned, we provided the draft 0 just last week. We're certainly looking for some feedback from the TGDC today. The hope is to get the life cycle policy into a publishable format as soon as possible. It's not a hard deadline reflected here on the graphic, but we're certainly open to any feedback that you guys have. We've been requesting feedback from our FACA boards going back to July, and so we're still open to receiving more of that feedback at this point.
Yeah, I'll add that we were very thankful that you gave us an opportunity to review and provide feedback. Was just curious if you were expecting that work to be complete. And then a follow on is, are you putting that out for additional public comment, or will you just be publishing it?
We are planning on putting it out for, additional public comment once we settle on verbiage for draft number 1.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lori. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in some detail later during the life cycle policy presentation.
Hi, this is Diane Golden. Can you provide links or some sort of reference to the revised test assertions? You were talking about clarifying some of the requirements in 2.0, et cetera. It would just be helpful for me to not have to dig around and try to find that stuff.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
certainly. It's available on the VBSG page on the EAC website. We can provide a link here in the comments momentarily. It's right next to the VBSG 2.0. You'll see test assertions version 1.1. And we've also published a gap analysis if you're familiar with test assertion version 1.0. We've done a difference report and provided that there, so you can easily see the changes rather than rereading the whole document.
okay, I will take a look at it, and I'm going to ask you a question then, which is, has the never-ending saga of understanding what it means to have accessible verification and casting of a paper ballot actually been clarified?
So we put some verbiage in here. Let me get a link for you to the actual document. We put some verbiage in for the assertion for, I believe it's 62-A. That largely revolves around the definitions of CAST as it's reflected in the VBSG. Put a link to that in the chat. There we go.
So this is Diane again. I'll take a look and see if I can read through it. So it sounds like what you're saying is the way the previous standards were, in my opinion, misinterpreted had to do with the definition of casting a paper ballot. Was there some other vernacular semantic issue with verification of the print on the paper, not the display on the screen, that had to be clarified also? So this time around, we, if anything ever gets submitted to 2.0, we actually get verification of the actual ballot, the print on the ballot, not the display on the screen.
The assertion doesn't go into that level of detail. It kind of reiterates the definition of CAST. Like I said, let's see. Got it here. Actually read.
Okay, I'll take a look and see if I can, yeah.
Okay.
Make a decision as to whether or not we're we're actually going to get to the accessibility standards being implemented as I think they were intended from the get-go, but never have been. So
yeah, it clarifies that the system must provide capability to independently cast a ballot by allowing a voter to irrevocably confirm their intent to vote as selected without assistance from an election worker or other person.
All right, if there are no other questions, maybe we can move on to Lisa's presentation.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Olta.
And Gemma, I believe, is firing up the presentation as we speak. All right, I'm seeing John, but that's okay. You can all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Well, that was, I mean, that didn't start off well, right? So thank you, Jim, very much. I'm going to go ahead and do the NIST voting program updates. As many of you know, the NIST voting program resides in the Information Technology Laboratory at NIST. I'm the Associate Director for IT Standardization in the Information Technology Lab. My role here today is as the Interim Program Manager of our voting program. As we still seek to replace Mary Brady, who is here back on the NIST team, our previous manager, and she's turning out to be a really tough act to follow, as many of you know. Go ahead to the next slide. We've also been working very hard since the approval of VBSG 2.0 this past winter. I want to touch on a few of the items that we've been working on, some of which we will discuss further in the agenda. I did want to point out the folks from the NIST voting team that are here. They are all experts in their respective areas and know way more than I do about the specifics of our program. And so I will not be shy about asking them to speak up and answer any questions you have. So with us, we have Gemma Howe, who's our cybersecurity lead. I know most of you all know her. Sharon Laskowski is here. She's our accessibility and usability lead. You all know her, and Andy Regenscheid, who's also a cybersecurity expert and a cryptography expert, and you all know him. We have two and John Wack is here as well. I noticed on the, I was reluctant to, I didn't mean to forget about him. And John Wack, who you all know as well, and he's back on the NIST voting team. The two folks that you may not be familiar with are Carrie Ann Buchanan and Kevin Mangold. Carrie Ann and Kevin are the lead authors on the document we're writing in response to the executive order, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well. Go ahead, Gemma. So let's talk about the NAVLAP program. Jim mentioned it and John mentioned it as well. Our goal in all of this with NAVLAP is to make sure that the testing laboratories are ready to test voting systems to 2.0. As many of you know, NAVLAP, which resides at NIST, is a third-party accreditation body. It accredits testing and calibration laboratories as competent to perform testing within a specific scope, like voting systems to a specific version of the VBSG. NIST uses NAVLAP as a bit of a gating function. Kevin talked about, I think it was Kevin, our role in HAVA to recommend test laboratories that can be accredited by the EAC for those laboratories to perform testing within the EAC certification program. NIST uses NAVLAP as that gating function. We only recommend laboratories that have been accredited through the NAVLAP program. So to get to being able to have NAVLAP accredit laboratories to VBSG 2.0 or to test voting systems to VBSG 2.0, we worked with the EAC mostly post February to make sure that the NAVLAP handbook, which is 150-22, is ready and incorporates some of the new requirements of VBSG 2.0 that John even talked about. And this is so that we know that have a confidence that those testing laboratories are competent to test voting systems to the VBSG 2.0 requirements. So we worked on updating that document and the assessor checklist that goes with it. Those are sort of the two key items that exist in any NAVLAP program. So we did that, and that is in the ready for publication. I think it's received almost its final approval for publication. And NAVLAP can accept applications to increase their the accreditation scope to VBSG 2.0 this month in October. So we're pretty happy about that. That was our goal. We met our goal. So NAVLAP can accept those applications. We certainly see this as a key milestone for the path of implementation, approval, and adoption to voting systems meeting the VBSG 2.0 requirements. You can go to the next slide. We'll talk a little bit about our efforts in managing cybersecurity risk. And I think many of you are familiar with some of these efforts. I believe Gemma has talked to you about them. So NIST has one of our flagship standards or documents called the Cybersecurity Framework. And the Cybersecurity Framework is really helpful in addressing cybersecurity risks across various sectors. We take what's called the profile. We create a profile of the cybersecurity framework and apply it to different sectors and even different technologies. And we think that can help in the election infrastructure as well. The other benefit that the CSF profile brings is to foster better communication among stakeholders in addressing cybersecurity risk. It gives that normalization of terminology and concepts and semantics. We often find when different people get in a room and start talking about cybersecurity, they use different nomenclature for some of the same terms and ideas. They think they're agreeing and they're actually talking about different things. So it really helps normalize that communication, makes that communication better. We think among election officials, system manufacturers, federal agencies, the IT shops of the jurisdictions, and other stakeholders. Gemma Howe, our cybersecurity lead, will discuss the CSF profile efforts with you later today on the agenda, but I'll give you a little preview of two of the profiles we have. One of them is on the election infrastructure as a total, as a profile. And you can see here, we've actually used the diagram and the concept that DHS CISA uses to describe its election infrastructure and processes. And we've pulled that graphic into the cybersecurity profile for election infrastructure. And we're using that in that document. We think that'll give us some better coordination opportunities and better sort of synergy in what's being discussed there. And then finally, that is almost ready again for final publication. It's in our NIST review process. And then the second cybersecurity profile that we're working on is on voter registration. Gemma and team worked on the early stages draft of the voter registration profile sort of at the beginning of COVID and in 2020 during a lot of the election activities going on. And so we have a pretty good base, but now we're starting to use our stakeholder engagement process. Certainly we'll be having a workshop at some point. We'll be having public comment periods on it and run through our normal process. So I'll leave more details about that to Gemma later in the day. If you can go to the next slide. So the other thing I wanted to mention were the VBSG 2.0 implementation guides. This is a really important activity and very important that we coordinate with the Election Assistance Commission, certainly because this is implementation guides to the VBSG 2.0. Our goal in providing these guides is to help overcome impediments to wide-scale adoption of 2.0. They're very topical, these guides. They address specific topics from requirements of the standard, either new requirements or requirements that we just think we need that little extra discussion and treatment. They fall into human factors related and cybersecurity related. Our guidance related to the human factors focuses on voting systems primarily during the design phase, which emphasizes the user-centric design in 2.0. You can see here that we have coverage on plain language, user-centered design, text and size contrasts, gestures, scrolling, assistive technology. The other guides in the human factor space speak to how to report out your user-centered design process and how you measured how you were improving throughout that process, recognizing that for a manufacturer to document the testing of the user-centered design process throughout their manufacturing, they can't just create those artifacts that show they used a user design process at the end. You just can't do it. You have to actually be doing a user-centered design process and creating those artifacts along the way. And so we provided some guidance on better how to do that. Those guides are an initial draft, and we're starting a NIST review process for that. The guidance related to cybersecurity, it does a couple things for election stakeholders. It talks to them about the potential impact of some of the 2.0 cybersecurity related requirements, and it provides recommendations and options for implementing those requirements. In each document, there's a section that talks about the goal of the requirement, a section on the vendor implementation. So it's talking to those voting system manufacturers on implementing those requirements. It talks to election officials, the impact of those requirements and what they need to do. And then it also talks about changes to the election landscape and what these requirements do that kind of are changing how the election systems are running. These are the areas you can see here. The first three, disabling wireless, air gaps, and auditing. We have those in draft, and we're going to begin coordinating on the content with the EAC. The other four, digital signatures, identifiers, multi-factor authentication, and E2E verifiable systems, we're still in draft mode for those. Can you go to the next one? So the final area we want to talk about is our response to the responsibilities we were given in Executive Order 14019, promoting access to voting. We are really excited about this. We're excited to be able to potentially have the opportunity and the impact for the ability of those with disabilities to vote privately and independently. You can see here in the executive order, there were specific voting activities called out, the registration process, using voting technology, voting by mail, polling locations, and poll worker training. We were also asked to look at the National Mail Voter Registration Form and look at it, not just the form itself, but the process of using that form. And so Carrie Ann Buchanan and Kevin Mangold from NIST are our lead authors. You'll hear from them later today about this. We are hoping that you will see a draft for public comment very, 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 very soon. We thought we might have something to say today, but we do not. But it should be certainly within the next week or so. Hopefully you'll see something from us about that. If you go to the next slide. So we can take questions now and discussion, and I will ask those on the NIST team to make sure that your microphone's open, and we can discuss any of these activities.
Thanks, Lisa. Any questions from anyone?
All right.
Okay.
We are only slightly over time, Jim. I'll turn it back to you.
I think we're doing very well.
All right.
Everybody so far. All right. So we're going to move into a fairly long session now, but over the next hour, we're going to look at the implementation of VBSG 2.0. I think we start with Paul Almayer, who's going to cover the VBSG lifecycle policy. And then after that, we'll move straight into John Panic and Andrew Regenscheid, who's going to talk about E2E processing and process and timelines. So hopefully about 30 minutes each. And then we'll have a short break after that, since the virtual meetings can get a little long if you have to sit there the whole time. So, all right. So Paul, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Althoff. First of all, can everybody see my slides?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Members of TGDC. I'm Paul Almayer with the testing and certification team at EAC, and I'm going to give an overview of the VBSG lifecycle policy that we've been drafting. And hopefully we've all already received a copy of the draft policy and at least have some chance to review it. So this is a policy we've been looking to implement for quite some time. There have been many calls from stakeholders, including from yourselves, to create and implement such a policy. There have been significant gaps in the updates to various revisions in the past. There was 10 years between 1.0 and 1.1. Another 6 years between 1.1 and 2.0, which was adopted last February. Having these gaps is something we don't really want moving forward. We're looking for there to be more regular updates with perhaps smaller changes in each increment. So the policy in itself outlines at a quite high level the initiation, review, implementation, and retirement of the VBSG versions. And obviously the TGDC plays an important part in the whole implementation of this policy. So in moving forward, the VBSG updates, as you might envision, it's likely there'll be major updates and minor updates. I think we probably sort of need to talk about what would be considered a major update and what would be a minor update. Starting with the majors, these really would be significant changes, and significant to probably just about all stakeholders, manufacturers, labs, election officials, and other interested parties. And would also would affect some field certified systems that could potentially render certified systems become obsolete. It might include updates or new principles, new guidelines, and requirements for the VBSG. Primary number would increment by 1. I think most people can agree that the difference between VBSG 1.0 and 1.1 is a major change. And also it may require re-accreditation of the labs under the NAVLAP system, which Lisa just talked about. This would really be determined by consultation between EAC and NAVLAP, and we'd look at the metrics such as a change in core or non-core competency of the labs, whether there be required skills of laboratory staff, or any other criteria really deemed necessary that are a result of the update. Minor changes. With minor changes, we would not be looking for significant updates or addition to system requirements. It would not likely affect hardware, not require new hardware by jurisdictions. We would look to keep the VBSG up to date. For instance, the VBSG references other standards, and we want to make sure that we reference the most current version of those standards. We also look to maintain the standards. For VBSG 2.0, we've already been receiving RFIs from manufacturers, and I think we anticipate a fair few more as well, especially as manufacturers start looking to bring new systems to the fore. And if there were any errata in the standards, we would look to include those, or we would look to correct them in the minor updates. And as you can probably guess, we anticipate that there will be quite a few more minor updates than major ones. Ultimately, I think it would be an EAC decision as to whether updates are going to be major or minor, but there would need to be considerable discussion with all affected stakeholders here. At the moment, we're not really looking to compile an exhaustive list of changes that will trigger a major update. It can be difficult to anticipate future innovations that might trigger a major update. And I think we've talked about a lot about deprecation, and this really means that deprecation refers to the retirement of a major revision of VBSG, and we all want to make it clear and loud and clear that deprecation of a standard does not mean decertification of the system. Decertification is an extremely serious issue, and that really doesn't happen until the process detailed in the manual, program manual, has been completed, and that is quite an exhaustive process. We know it's something that election officials have been worried about, especially as how it affects their laws, their regulations, and their policy. And the chosen timeline, as I think it's already been mentioned, for deprecation is 24 months, and that is after the accreditation of at least one VSTL to test to the new standard. That is the trigger to start. So, systems that are certified to a deprecated standard will likely need maintenance while still fielded by jurisdictions. And there will be, those updates will be permitted under one or more of 5 categories. And these are security updates that would address a known vulnerability or exploit. They do come reasonably often. A bug fix, and that would be to fix a known issue with the system that's been reported to the EAC by a manufacturer or by a jurisdiction. And Jurisdictions are looking to purchase all these systems that will last at least 10 years. Given the life cycle of COTS hardware, such as desktop, laptop, PCs, there may be several replacement of them during the life of a voting system. The jurisdictional rule change, and that would be a legal requirement that forces a manufacturer to make changes to a field system. And that would need to be supported by the jurisdiction itself. That could be, for example, a state's chief election official. And finally, updating a major component to bring it up to the latest VBSG standard. This would mean that system can be brought up to VBSG 2.0, one component at a time. In this case, the baseline system would retain the 1.0 certification until all components of the system are brought up to VBSG 2.0 compliance. Any modifications, such as enhancements or added features to the system, will not be accepted for testing and certification if it's outside of these 5 categories. When a manufacturer applies for a modification to a system that is certified to a deprecated standard, they'll need to clearly state under which category they are applying for, and will need to supply supporting documentation for that claim. The current application actually already requires manufacturers to list modifications made, and supporting documentation is currently required for changes such as ECOs. So this is nothing new. And the review and update process. VBSG review and update process will follow HAVA, that's section 2.222. And I think we've already mentioned that there will be a 12-month review cycle. EOC will collect proposed revisions from interested parties throughout the year. And this feedback will be summarized by the Test and Certification Division in an annual report that's sent to the EOC Director. At this point, the thoughts of TGDC will be sought and looking for your feedback. And following discussion with TGDC, we'll work with NIST to address those updates. And the EOC Executive Director will forward updates to the Standard Board and board advisors. And if there aren't any substantive changes at that time, then we'll be looking to hold no further action until the next cycle would begin. So as a result, there'll be an annual review process to consider updates to the VBSG, but just because there is a review process doesn't mean that there will be a new version each year. So once those substantial changes have been identified, the draft created, it'll just go through the HAVA section 222 that is previously done in the past. One important point is that this process will go even with a lack of quorum admission. Lack of quorum would delay a vote, obviously on implementation of the new version, but the ongoing work detail will still be followed. And at that point, I'll turn it over to members of TGDC for any thoughts or comments that you may have. Thank you.
This is Paul Lux. I had a question. So your last slide covered what happens in the event that the commissioners don't have a quorum, which of course has been a concern of ours for some time. And I note that in the draft document, it specifies that, sections 4.4.1 through 4.4.5 won't be or will be executed on an annual basis, but recommendations the 4.4, 6, and 7 have to wait for the quorum. But when I see back in section 2.1, where it says the EAC will determine whether a change is major or minor, who is that? It doesn't, I mean, are we talking about commissioners are the ones who make that call? Is it the EAC testing and certification department? Who on behalf of the EAC is doing that?
So this is Mona. I'm going to jump in here for a second. And thanks for your question. I think a couple of things on that. One is that we say the EAC because ultimately that's the Election Assistance Commission, and that would include discussions amongst the commissioners. But because the process is so transparent, we're working with our boards and following the HAVA process, that would also include all of our stakeholders and the boards and making that determination. So I think in some cases, it'll be pretty clear and obvious what we do with it. In other cases, it'll be more complex. And whatever those recommendations are, they would come to the EAC. And ultimately, I believe, the commissioners would make that decision. But I think there would be a lot of substantive discussion and recommendations leading up to that final determination. And then just in general on the quorum, I think, there's a dynamic here where we really worry about the quorum, and I really understand why that's a concern. There's also just thinking through what the process looks like leading up to the package with the bow on it, if you will. So there is a lot of work for NIST to do, a lot of work for the EAC staff to do, a lot of work for the TGDC to do throughout the process of making enhancements, changes, or adding requirements or whatever is being done within the scope of the VBSG, leading up to the commissioners voting on something. So I feel like that's the very last step, but the heavy lift is happening before it even gets to them, theoretically, based on the VBSG process. So that doesn't completely eliminate the concern, but what it tells us is, though, despite there being a quorum or not, the EAC has to continue the ongoing reviews, continue the discussions, engage the boards, keep things, keep the work going. And if there isn't a quorum, after all the work is done and it's sitting there waiting on the shelf for someone to adopt, I think that raises other concerns, but I don't know that that has occurred. I think there's so much to do behind the scenes before it gets to that point.
I'm Mona. This is McDermott Coots. I actually would like to point out there was a situation where that did occur. This was specific around the default volume that literally could not be changed. We had to test to something that was unacceptable, and it could not be changed because there was not a quorum. So it has happened, and we got stuck with it, and it was not a pleasant experience, which is kind of why there's a little PTSD around it.
I appreciate that.
Paul, this is McDermott again. I do have one question. I know that we can test individual components to the VBSG 2.0, and then the system itself retains whatever the original certification is. What's the scenario where every component has been individually certified to 2.0, but the system itself does not meet a particular functional component of the VBSG? It seems like a sort of a special state there.
So McDermott, this is John. What part, if each of the individual components is updated to 2.0, what part of the system are you envisioning is not compliant at that point?
So we get to the situation that Diane is most concerned about, where making sure that everybody can can cast the ballot without assistance. So the definition of the system means that there can be components that don't do that, as long as one of them does. So you can, at that point, theoretically have a scenario where every component is certified to the 2.2.0 standard, but the system itself does not meet the entirety of the requirements.
Right.
So at that point,
Well,
stay at wherever you are.
yeah, ultimately it would be a 1.0 certified system.
Yeah.
Every
mean, you-
I'll just jump in because I was gonna follow up, not exactly in that same direction, but in essence, the 5 situations in which you can do changes, and especially that last one where you can upgrade, quote unquote, or you can move a component to 2.0. In essence, what that's going to mean for the vast majority of systems currently out there is that whatever is currently in use as the segregated, quote unquote, accessible system is petrified, locked in place for the next 100 years. There's no reason for a vendor to ever attempt to upgrade that because they can move everything else around it, which is, quite frankly, easier, more cost effective, more what people are going to demand. Yeah, which negates the whole idea of 2.0 and anything else around it. I mean, accessibility will be, benched, frozen in time, and everything else is going to move forward around it.
Well, ultimately, you can't have a 2.0 certified system if the full system doesn't meet the full set of standards. And so it wouldn't be able to be something that's you could reflect as 2.0 certified, if that makes sense.
Sure, but there's no requirement for people to use 2.0. 1.0 is fine. I mean, if you're not going to decertify, which nothing's decertifying anything, you're just, quote unquote, decommissioning older standards to be used currently. Well, if there's no decertification process, that auto mark that's been around since 2005 is going to be around till 2050.
This is Mona. I just want to mention the 2.0 component part is designed as a bridge to 2.0. You won't be able to modify those 2.0 components outside the reasons we listed. So there's really no negation. Just wanted to clarify that. I think there's some confusion on that portion of the program, which I think the EAC would be more than happy to further develop and maybe have a meeting outside of this meeting, because I think that probably deserves its own discussion.
Yeah, questions for Paul?
Yeah, hi, this is Bob Giles. So following up on Paul's question, so basically you're still in a position where you're not willing to make any changes to the VBSG unless you have a quorum, even if they're de minimis. So because you have major and minor changes to the VBSG standards, but you're still in a position that if there's a minor change that needs to occur during a lack of quorum, everybody has to wait. So we've been asking for years that you guys address this particular situation because it has happened multiple times or for over a long period of time. And we're still kind of in the same situation where we're saying, if we don't have a quorum, oh, well, nothing can occur. So I don't know if you can comment on that, why we haven't moved forward with that.
Bob, this is Mona. I think maybe since this continues to come up and feels like it eats up a lot of these meetings, so it's obviously an important and hot topic for everybody. Perhaps this is something that Congress can address that's in HAVA that talks about the commissioner's responsibility and their policy. So, we can't change what's written in HAVA. it may be worth that avenue, since it seems like it's definitely above our pay grade. So that's where the issue lies, you know, and I totally recognize and empathize the challenges of what this causes. I think the commissioners recognize that too. We've had a lot of discussions, but it's just one of those things where if that's what HAVA says is the process, we can't change HAVA. And so whether that means trying to get an opinion from the GAO, which typically takes a couple of years, that may be an option. Perhaps we can, you know, try and understand the intent of the statute better, but it's pretty clearly defined what is, you know, that the VBSG is policy. And if the VBSG is not policy, what is policy? And why do we have commissioners? You know, it's a hard legal challenge. It's not the EAC trying to stand in the way of good work and continuous effort of enhanced, improved requirements. All of us want this as much as you do and all the stakeholders. It makes sense to have an agile, resilient process that keeps things updated, but it's not that easy to just say, okay, well, we don't need the commissioners to vote on this as a matter of policy. We run into potential legal challenges, and federal compliance is definitely something that, you know, our IG and other auditing type federal agencies such as GAOs check on.
So I mean, it sounds like you recognize the same concerns we have. So you put it on us to ask Congress. Have you gone to Congress to ask for a change, to say, look, there's a serious concern among election officials around the country. You're limiting the job the EAC can do without a quorum. We would like to see a change rather than put it on us. Have you guys addressed that with Congress?
Well, I'm not really putting it on you, but a lot of you do speak to Congress. And so it just becomes a louder voice. The agency does submit every now and then various ledge proposals. I can tell you for a fact, the hardest thing to do is to get HAVA changed. The agency has had numerous ledge proposals historically, none of which have been changed. So it's not about putting it on you. It's more about, you know, if that's a message you want to amplify, feel free to do so. But I think that's where, I'm just saying that's where the challenge is.
Understood, but I think it would be easier and more powerful for us if it came from you and started at the top, and then we reinforced and supported your opinion that there should be some mechanism in place, some fail-safe in place, that if there's a lack of quorum. Us kind of yelling from the outside is not as helpful as you guys saying we need this and we have the support of the election community.
Bob, the EAC did take action to address some of this. So the policy was changed so that the various FACA boards can continue to operate without a quorum. So the EAC recognized, you know, that was an issue last time there was a lack of quorum. We didn't have meetings for years. Everything was frozen. So now there are ways for DFOs to be assigned and for the boards to continue to meet and to work on TGDC and go through the process of public comment. We're talking about the final step, which is the EAC commissioners voting on policy. That is with them.
Understood, and I guess that's what it's frustrating for us, because we are concerned that we find ourselves in that position somewhere down the road, and we fall way behind, and that's why we fell so far behind this time. And now we're playing catch up, and we're talking about, you know, trying to transition from 1.0 to 2.0 when everything's been built to 1.0, and it's going to take years to build to 2.0. Had we released these 6 years ago, we wouldn't be in this boat of concern. So that's where I think a lot of us are coming from, that even if it takes a few years, it's already taken a few years to get to, longer than a few years to get here. So when you start looking at the long-term goal and the long-term value of having something in place, should there not be a quorum, I think it's worth the effort. So that's, and I don't want to take the whole meeting up on this, and you guys know I'm passionate about that, and a lot of the election officials are. So I just think we can't keep kicking the can down the road and saying, oh, well, somebody talk to Congress and maybe they'll change it. I think there needs to be a stronger effort. So thank you.
Bob, Mr. Chair, this is DFO. Bob, I hear you. I've heard you over the years. I really think that from my perspective, there's a number of issues with HAVA that we've all had to address and say, well, we would have done things differently. And there's a number of issues that the commissioners talk about all the time that we wish certain things were slightly modified, make things easier. There was more incentives for the VBSG, for example. My point is that I think maybe we should just sit down and talk about what would be a consensus recommendation to the Congress. And with the understanding that we have recommended a number of different things without going into specifics, but opening up HAVA is a very difficult process. It's a lot more than just listening to the commissioners or the election community. But I do think that perhaps there's an opportunity for us to sit down and what would a consensus recommendation look like to improve the VBSG, to improve the issue of concern about the quorum. But we are where we are because of the Help America Vote Act, the way it's written. And so, you know, I'll just tell you the way we deal with issues. If there are some issues that HAVA gets in the way, we will make a recommendation to the Congress. And I think that's probably how we have to deal with this issue, because I don't think just talking about it continuously, we can only work around it as much as possible, as much as we can. I think that let's actually talk about what that might look like from a joint perspective. The stakeholders say, look, it's a very limited, VBSG. How can we improve that process? And I'm happy to sit down and talk with you, or a group from the election community and talk about how we do that.
So I mean that would be a step in the right direction. So if you're committing today that you'll sit down and write and work on something, and you guys would be willing to write something to Congress along those lines, and then we can go from there. At least, I guess, then at least we'd say we've done everything we got. You guys have written to Congress. We've supported that opinion, and if we find ourselves in that situation down the road again, nobody can point to us or to you to say you didn't do enough. You took it as far as you could, and if Congress is not willing specifically to do anything with that issue, then that's where it lies. But I think and I agree with you 100%, Don. And you were, before you were a commissioner, you were working on this with all of us, going back years. And so you understand the frustration level that we had to assemble our own group through NASED and BPC and all of that to work on these when we didn't have a quorum. So yeah, again, I don't want to belabor it on this, but if that's a commitment, then yeah, I think we could put a group of election officials together, get together with you guys and see what message we could get to Congress, and then we can support that from our side as well. So thank you.
I mean, look, I'm always willing to talk and see if we can find a consensus recommendation to the Congress. And I don't think, I mean, I have all the, I thought about it a couple of different ways, but I'm sure between some stakeholders and yourself and the members of this committee or other election officials, that we can find, maybe there's a consensus language that we can talk about here with the commissioners and the staff.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Good, very good. Well, this has obviously been a long-standing issue, but I think that sounds like a reasonable path forward. So we need to move on to the next topic. So I think we'll pass it over now to John and Andrew, who are going to cover the 2E process and timeline. So, John, Andrew.
Thank you. I think I'll start. Before I get going, though, I just want to confirm that you can hear me and see my screen.
Yes.
Great, thank you. So I'm Andy Regenscheid. I am the crypto applications lead within the cryptographic technology group at NIST and a longstanding member of the voting team. Good to see so many familiar faces and names. It's been a while since I've briefed the TGDC. I'm going to talk about the process that NIST and the EAC have been putting together for how to evaluate end-to-end protocols for systems that would be going through the testing and certification program. I'll kind of step through the process, and then John will come around, I think, at the end and give some thoughts on next steps. Just to level set, as I'm sure many of you know, one of the major additions in the VBSG 2.0 was the concept of auditability through software independence, that an undetected change or error in voting system software cannot cause an undetectable change or error in the election outcome. And the VBSG provides two paths for that in polling place voting equipment. The first path is based on paper, using voter verifiable paper records of ballot selections. And the second path is using end-to-end verifiable voting systems that use advanced mathematical and cryptographic techniques. End-to-end systems have not been used in certified voting systems before, and they do present some new challenges on how to validate and test the technologies and implementations. And this really comes in two parts. The first part is an evaluation of those special mathematical and cryptographic algorithms that underpin the auditability properties. And in particular, the VBSG requires that those algorithms and protocols be EAC approved. And then the second part to that is that the implementations of those algorithms in voting systems must be correct. And in this case, the VBSG requires an independent evaluation of the protocol in the voting system. I'll be mostly talking about that first piece today on, all right, how do we establish a program to approve those protocols? And in many ways, both of these challenges is quite, both of these requirements are quite similar to how we approach other cryptographic techniques in voting systems, like encryption algorithms that might protect data. The VBSG requires the use of standardized, well-vetted algorithms that have been approved by NIST, and implementations of those algorithms must be tested through the separate cryptographic module validation program. But in the case of end-to-end systems, there are no existing standards or validation programs to handle that new technology. So, before diving into the process, I want to give some more background on what end-to-end verifiable voting systems and protocols are. These are specially designed cryptographic protocols that support a chain of verification and auditing steps from ballot casting through tabulation. It's usually described in these three properties. The first is that they allow voters to verify their selections were captured by the system correctly. The second is that voters can confirm that those ballot selections were properly recorded and included in the results. And then the third piece is public verification of the vote counts. Paper-based voting systems achieve similar properties of software independence through the use of those voter verifiable paper records combined with assurances around chain of custody and post-election audits. End-to-end systems achieve these properties through mathematical proofs. However, I do want to acknowledge that they may also use paper records for some part of the process. And in fact, I think most, if not all, of the current proposals that I'm aware of do use paper for some part of the process. So providing these properties while still providing all of the other critical properties that voting systems need is what makes this a challenging process. That they need to provide these verification properties while at the same time protecting voter privacy and ballot secrecy. So you can't, for instance, allow people to say prove how they voted. And of course, as many of you know, usability and accessibility have been perennial concerns, including with end-to-end systems that have been proposed in the past. So while there may be complicated mathematics going on behind the scenes, the voting process itself must be simple and accessible. I'll give just a really brief overview of what these systems might look like. The voting process for probably a typical end-to-end system would likely look very similar to that of other to using an electronic ballot marking device. The main difference being that at the end of that voting process, the voter would receive a confirmation code. It might be a QR code. It might be something like that looks like a transaction number, similar to what you may see in financial transactions. But in this case, that code has a special meaning in that you can effectively think of it as an encrypted version of the vote. And this is where one of the first challenges of end-to-end systems and protocols comes into play, that the voter has to be able to confirm that encrypted vote in the confirmation code reflects their actual choices. The next step would be all of those encrypted votes and confirmation codes are posted publicly, allowing voters to go and check that their votes were included by looking for their confirmation code. And then finally, all of those publicly posted encrypted votes can be tabulated by the voting system using some special tricks that allow the system to prove that the reported tally matches that set of encrypted votes. So, the concepts of end-to-end systems have been around and studied for nearly 40 years. So, while we're certainly not starting from scratch, there's been some, there'll be some challenges in how we approach this. The first I touched on before, which is that, these systems are not built on or do not at least exclusively use standards compliant mechanisms, either the protocols themselves or the algorithms. And what this means is that it's going to be critically important to validate and verify the security and properties that those protocols provide. And that's something that requires careful review. This isn't just a matter of checklist compliance. It needs rigorous evaluations by subject matter experts. And next, of course, we need to keep in mind that these systems include new types of human interactions. There's unique usability and accessibility challenges that we're going to have to keep in mind as we look at both the protocols and the systems that use them. And finally, there'll be some new challenges in how we approach the testing and validation of those implementations. The current testing and certification program is not designed to evaluate implementations, of these protocols and systems. And of course, addressing all of those points, won't be enough if the public doesn't have trust and confidence in those technologies. And this might be the biggest challenge. The public understands the current process, giving them confidence in the results. For end-to-end systems to be adopted and accepted, the public is going to, need to accept them, and that's going to mean that we need to establish a process that will build trust and confidence in those protocols and technologies. And I'd say that the challenges in evaluating and adopting end-to-end protocols is similar to that of adopting other cryptographic algorithm standards. And NIST has a long history of working on just that, developing many of the cryptographic algorithm standards that are considered really the gold standard in the US and around the world. Just like for end-to-end voting protocols, this means, developing security evaluation processes for cryptographic standards, really for things that are inherently hard to analyze. It also means ensuring that the process itself will build trust and confidence so that implementers and users, will have trust to adopt and use those technologies. So in order to address this, NIST has long used open and transparent public evaluation processes that bring together researchers, academia, industry, and practitioners to propose, analyze, test, and vet potential algorithms. It starts with a public call for proposals, detailing requirements and evaluation criteria. All of those proposals that are received then are released to the public comment for review, typically lasting, multiple rounds or years. And in this process, NIST acts as an impartial technical authority, evaluating the candidates and the public input while publicly documenting the rationale for our decisions. So here on this slide shows an example of one such process that's active right now, the post-quantum cryptography selection process. This is what we're using to develop standards for new cryptographic algorithms that could resist attacks by quantum computers. a new type of computer that industry and governments are spending billions to develop. This effort has been going on now for more than 6 years, growing out of a research program at NIST to a public competition-like process that 82 teams initially contributed to. Over 3 years of reviews, we've reduced the set to 15 candidates and intend to make the first selections by early next year. And to be clear, these processes require substantial time and effort, but this is really the best way that we've found to build trust and confidence in cryptographic algorithms. And it pays off. The standards that NIST has developed in this manner have gone on to be used broadly worldwide, protecting everything from financial transactions to classified data to this very video conference. So, since the adoption of the VBSG 2.0, NIST and the EAC have been discussing and formulating a plan on how we will evaluate end-to-end protocols. And the plan that we've put together is closely based on the processes that NIST has used for cryptographic standards. It starts out with community building engagement to put together detailed plans and processes with input from election officials and researchers and technology experts. Like NIST processes, the proposal includes an open call for proposals that would outline end-to-end protocol requirements and evaluation criteria. The submitted proposals would undergo multiple rounds of review in public and engaging, where we would engage stakeholders at workshops and conferences and online fora. And in this process, NIST and the EAC would act as that impartial authority, assessing the candidates and the public feedback against the evaluation criteria and requirements. When approval decisions are made, the work doesn't end there. Those protocols would then need to be maintained and monitored, particularly watching out for new results that could question the integrity or security of those protocols. And I think all of these are critical elements of the process, and they all take time. On this slide, I have some, expected timelines for each step, ranging from, about 6 to 12 months to put together a call for proposals and rounds of public review of a year. If you add these together, it suggests that, perhaps as soon as 4 years, we could, make some initial selections. Although I'll note that that's heavily influenced by the number and type of submissions, as well as the feedback we get from the community. And I want to, next step through it in a little bit more detail, some of the key elements of each of those steps. First, I want to emphasize the need to do some community building to bring people together. Because this is a new area, this is critically important. While we've seen increased collaboration between the security and elections communities, this is a slightly different group with a slightly different goal. So some of this will mean outreach to the stakeholders at the venues where they already are, and some of this will be inviting them and perhaps pulling them into the evaluation process itself. But regardless, we need to build consensus around the scope and process, as well as the critical objectives, requirements, and evaluation criteria. So the input that we get from the community then needs to be reflected in that call for proposals that goes out, as that really provides the foundation for the rest of the process. And this comes in 3 pieces mostly. The first part of that call for proposals is the submission requirements. And remember, this is a process for approving those end-to-end protocols, not the voting systems. So I think the expectation is that we'd be getting descriptions of algorithms and protocols along with reference implementations, but not full voting systems. We will want some form of mockups on describing how those protocols would be intended to function with the voting system. So we could make some initial assessments around usability and accessibility. But that's one thing that we'll need to discuss further with the community to understand, what would be needed in the submissions to do that. Another thing that we'll need to discuss is intellectual property. At the very least, I think we will need to ensure that the public evaluation allows open evaluation of both the protocol and reference implementations. And I think we'll also want to be at least aware of any relevant intellectual property. The second critical part of the call for proposals is the protocol requirements. The VBSG 2.0 already has high-level requirements for end-to-end systems, as well as general requirements for human factors, auditability, and security. But it's going to be important to tailor and extend those to be, more objective and clear, so that submitters to this process can appropriately tailor their submissions. And the third major piece is evaluation criteria. Basically, how are we going to assess these submissions? Likely this would include looking at their specific auditability properties, looking at the maturity of the design and the supporting analysis, looking at an assessment of usability and accessibility for voters and poll workers, and many other things. I also want to acknowledge up front that, one of the things that happens in these processes is that we learn a lot about how to assess submissions in the process. And including how to weigh some of those criteria. So while we want to be as clear as we can up front, we also want to make sure we can take advantage of everything we learn during the evaluation period. Based on what we've seen in cryptographic standards processes, I expect the submission and public evaluation process would be largely driven by academic researchers. As mentioned before, all the submissions that we would receive to a process like this would be posted online, including the specifications, reference implementations, and supporting analysis. Really what we want to do is facilitate and encourage public review of the submissions as much as we can and get as much feedback and analysis as we can. And that means providing a variety of engagement methods for the community to both review and provide feedback on the submissions. NIST will, of course, do our own technical evaluation of the candidates, but for a process like this to work, really the bulk of the analysis should be coming from the community. And the primary role of NIST and the EAC would be to act as the convener and engage stakeholders, and also then serve as that impartial authority when assessing the submissions and the public feedback. Each year, the proposal that we've outlined would have NIST and the EAC working together to make decisions about the submissions and candidates that remain, deciding which protocols could be approved, which ones should be rejected for failing to meet the requirements, and which ones ultimately need further study before a decision could be made. We'd be looking for a sufficient body of research and evidence that would demonstrate that a particular protocol meets the requirements and evaluation criteria. And to be clear, I think we should expect that each proposal would likely need multiple rounds of evaluation prior to being able to make a decision. Often, research ends up creating more questions before it answers them. And as I mentioned before, once algorithms and protocols are approved, the work doesn't stop there. Approved protocols would need to be maintained and monitored, watching out for any new results. This could result in changes to the protocols themselves to deal with, new vulnerabilities or issues that have been identified, and that would itself require a special public process. And this is, one of many good reasons to be very cautious and thoughtful about the approach that we would use to approving protocols. I do have a lot of questions for you. I'm sure you have questions for us as well. I guess as a next step, I want to turn it over to John Panic to talk a little bit about some of the next steps before we go on into a discussion and question period. You there, John?
Yes, thank you, Andy. Appreciate the extremely thorough presentation, Andy. I just wanted to mention a couple things that the EAC's been working with NIST on this to talk out the plan, and that we're early in the process of writing up properties and scope for the protocol to have further discussions with NIST very early in this process. But as Andy mentioned, it needs to be extremely well defined and bounded even prior to kicking off an initial working group. And so that's really where we're at right now. The next steps after that would be to establish that initial working group, the community around making some of these early decisions on how this evaluation process is going to go. So I do want to save a couple minutes at least to see if you guys have any questions or any comments and feedback about this process or any suggestions.
Yeah, thanks, John. I mean, I think, at this point we can, open it up. I see David Wagner has his hand raised on the Zoom meeting.
I wanted to share with you my thanks and appreciation for putting together this this proposal. This looks like this would be a really valuable process and one that would be very effective at generating public trust. And I've previously done work in the area of cryptography. So for those of you who are not specialists in that area, I thought I'd share with you my experience, which is that NIST has run processes like this before to select cryptographic standards. And in my view, they've been extraordinarily successful. They generated tremendous public value. They've been very successful at creating public trust. And so I think NIST is the perfect entity to run this kind of a process. Thanks for the chance to comment.
Thanks, David. Any other questions from the TGDC members?
Dan just raised his hand.
So I also wanted to follow on with Dave and say that I think NIST has done a great job in the past with this class of standards, and I think it's a great place to go. One of the places that I think is going to be an interesting challenge, and maybe this is getting too far into the weeds, but like there are protocols that you can design and write down the cryptography, and the math is great, but then you build it into a physical system, and then even that might be great, but then you go at the next step and say, well, okay, it's going to be paper ballots versus, oh, let's do it online. And somebody says, oh, but it's certified and tested and all that. Yeah, but you did it in a slightly different way, and that's not the same thing. So I think it's going to be an interesting challenge of how we can both certify without locking down precisely how you want to do it, because there's a lot of wiggle room there. I think that'll be an interesting and fun part of this process.
Thank you, Dan. Paul, I see you have your hand up.
Hey, Andrew, I've been working with you for years and years and years on a lot of different things at a lot of different levels. And I'm happy to hear both David and Dan's enthusiastic support. I was going to ask if there's an English version of your presentation available. I always just give you a little bit of a hard time.
Hey, I left the equations out.
And we appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, I see McDermott Coots has his hand up. Do you have the floor?
Well, thank you. And so just a quick question from a practical standpoint of building the system, an E2E system, that we're really looking probably 4 to 5 years out before we even have the algorithms available that we can then build into a system. Is that a fair assessment of the timeline? I'm just trying to put my R&D timeline into place for this sort of thing. And I really appreciate that we're starting it now, because when it starts with the first step, and I appreciate the work that's going to happen first. But is that essentially true?
I mean, that's true from the perspective of getting to final approved protocols. As Dan Wallach just mentioned, I mean, obviously within that process, we would love for the manufacturer community to be, weighing in on how they see the practicality or any implementation challenges that might see, and being able to adopt those submissions. So hopefully the manufacturer community would be very involved in the selection and evaluation process.
Right, but from a practical standpoint of having systems ready to go, we're probably looking 7 to 8 years.
Yeah, I think you would know better than I on how long the development side of that would take. But yes, I think that sounds about right. I
mean, we could probably short circuit it as depending on how involved the developer community is on them. And again, the open sourceness of the algorithms. But okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
This is Lori Agino. I would just add that a longer runway or a longer process for this work may not be a bad thing, because I'm not sure the voting public is 100% ready for this in the near term. Although I love it and it's super cool, and really enjoyed the discussion and presentation today. So I would say having a longer process for doing that research and going through that process, like I said, might run and concurrently sounding like matching what the vendor's ability and expectation are, that process lasting a little longer and being more thoughtful on both sides might lend itself well to the work that needs to be done. So thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate the comment. Yeah, I mean, I think clearly we have a lot of work, cut out for us in this process, and I think there's going to be, a lot more, stakeholder engagement that we'll need to be doing over the coming months to, talk to these different groups, talk to the academics, talk to the manufacturers, talk to election officials around, both what they'd like to see out of the process and the submissions, but then also, talk to them about how to best engage them in the evaluation process. So you know how to reach us. Our emails are always open, or we're always free for phone calls to have, more discussions with you around how we can best reach out to, some of those different groups and engage them in this effort. Do we have any other questions or comments from the TGDC members? Yeah, Dan?
So I just wanted to add one other thing. I don't speak for Microsoft, but Microsoft has been working on a thing called Election Guard. And they, a couple months ago, announced a partnership with Hardinger Civic, where their Election Guard API will be embedded in an unspecified Hardinger Civic product to be used in an unspecified pilot election. So the details are not public, but this could be happening. This long timeline might be something we want to consider accelerating if this pilot is successful, and et cetera.
And I think, I hope we'll be able to learn, quite a bit from efforts like that would feed into both the evaluation process as well as, future efforts around testing and evaluation of the voting systems themselves. All right, so I do see we're a little over time. I'll turn it back over to Dr. Althoff.
All right, well, thanks. Thank you, Andy and John and Paul. That was covering two really important topics in a short period of time. So very well done. All right, why don't we take, we're scheduled for a 10-minute break. Why don't we, I think we can afford the whole 10 minutes. So being from NIST, I'll say we will reconvene promptly at 3:04. So, all right, Eastern time. Thank you. right, everyone, it's 3:04. We're going to move on now. Mona Harrington of the EAC is going to present on electronic poll books and ballot delivery and voter registration systems. And then Gemma Howell is going to present on election infrastructure, voter registration, cybersecurity framework profiles. So Mona.
Thank you, Director. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to present on the EAC's pilot program for election supporting technology, more specifically e-poll books. To begin, I wanted to define election supporting technology. You could see that on the screen: specialized software and hardware utilized by election administrators that is dedicated to supporting election functions outside of the functions performed by voting systems as already defined by HAVA and described in the VBSG. The EAC's identified electronic poll books, or EPBs, as a technology that operates on the front lines of the nation's electoral process and is in the most immediate need of strong security, usability, and accessibility standards. The EAC would like to identify opportunities to provide best practices or other similar materials for other election supporting technologies in the future, but those might not end up fitting into a testing and certification type methodology. The authority we're operating under is Section 231 of HAVA, which provides the EAC with broad authority for the voluntary testing, certification, decertification, recertification of voting system hardware and software. And Section 201 of HAVA established the EAC as a national clearinghouse of information and best practices for the administration of federal elections, including related to voting system standards, voluntary guidance, and certification programs. According to data collected during our 2020 Election Administration and Voting Survey, or EVES, EPBs are used in 30.8%, or 1,991 of jurisdictions in 38 states of jurisdictions that responded. 16 states and territories reported use of EPBs by all of their jurisdictions. Of the states that responded to a question asking about EPB testing and certification, 12 reported that testing and certification is required by statute, 10 reported that testing and certification is required by a formal administrative rule or as guidance, and 17 reported that testing and certification was not at all required. The EAC conducted a lit review of state EPB statutes, rules, and guidance and found that most did not address security, accessibility, or usability. The EAC plans to implement a pilot testing and certification program for EPBs that closely contours the existing voting system testing and certification program. This leverages a well-understood process and allows us to utilize existing expertise and organizational structure to determine the effectiveness of this type of program. The pilot will develop the following key elements. As you can see on the screen, requirements and responsibilities for participants in the program, a way for manufacturers to register to formally participate, testing requirements and procedures, reporting and certification artifacts, and a quality monitoring program. Our goal is to complete testing and/or certification of at least 2 EPB systems by the end of calendar year 2022. The EAC is currently working with a contractor well-versed in testing the security of EPB systems to create draft security requirements. As you can see on the screen, the requirements will cover the following areas: access control, physical security measures, software security, network and telecommunications security, software design and architecture standards, audit records, quality assurance, and configuration management. Some requirements will be specific to EPB systems that are operated in a standalone versus connected online configuration. Use cases and attack scenarios are being developed for publishing as part of the requirements. We are very interested in hearing from you today regarding the topics covered in the draft security requirements of which I just listed. We hope to share a more detailed requirements doc with you in the near future. Moving forward, the EAC plans to utilize accessibility and usability experts, both internally and with NIST, to draft accessibility requirements. The EAC recognizes accessibility requirements are just as important as security requirements. Regarding the usability requirements, we hope to use experts both internally and within our federal partners at NIST, but also election officials in states that have mature e-poll book programs in use. This will be standards-based and utilized existing relevant VBSG requirements where possible. Draft program management documents such as a program manual and manufacturer registration mechanisms, We'll hold a public hearing in mid-November to discuss the pilot program and receive feedback from EPB manufacturers, election administrators, laboratories, and accessibility and security experts. We hope to begin test pilots by second quarter fiscal year 2022 and release a report on our findings in late 2022 or early 2023. After evaluation of the pilot, the EAC will determine whether to expand it to additional election supporting technologies or to continue the pilot longer until we reach success. We're interested in hearing your thoughts today regarding our approach. That concludes my presentation. I'm open for questions if you have any at this time.
Hi, this is Bob Giles. Hi, Mona.
Hello.
I think this is great. I think you guys are off to a good start. I'm just curious, you said you hired a contractor. Who's the contractor that you're utilizing?
So I wouldn't necessarily be in a position in public format to discuss the specifics of who the contract was awarded to, just for the sake of not trying to promote a private business. But I will say, I could talk to you offline, but I have the utmost confidence in the contractor that we selected. They're globally recognized for their cybersecurity skill set, but also have extensive expertise working with e-poll books and many, many states.
Okay, yeah, I'm just curious because we in New Jersey over the last 2 years we put in a whole program and we're rolling out electronic poll books this fall for the whole state. So I think this is fantastic. And I guess my only concern when you talk about test pilots, and it kind of gets to almost what you were just saying about promoting a private vendor. How are you going to balance that you don't use one vendor as a test pilot and then they run around saying we are the only ones, certified by or gone through the process with the EAC?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we'll go through the pilot process more to enhance the process, generally speaking, but that wouldn't necessarily result in certification that would allow them to be a step ahead and use that to profit. So we'll find a nice, delicate balance to test the process and ensure we have all our I's dotted and T's crossed, while at the same time not giving any manufacturer an advantage, but allow us to learn from that to have a well-oiled machine.
That's great. And if you need volunteers, like I said, we just went through it. We actually use our state's division of gaming. They certify all of our gaming equipment for Atlantic City. They're the ones who do the testing for us. So any help, New Jersey can offer, we're glad to be of assistance.
We will definitely be calling New Jersey. Thanks for
saying. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Okay, Director, back to you.
Thank you very much, Mona. On to Gemma, please.
While we're switching over slides, I will say hello, everyone. It's been a while, but it's great to see everyone again. For those that don't know, I'm Gemma Howell. I lead the cybersecurity efforts on the NIST voting team. Here we go. Getting my slides up. Okay. All right. So this presentation will primarily go over the work to develop election profiles using the cybersecurity framework. In the beginning, Lisa gave a great overview and some background information on what the cybersecurity framework is and some of the potential benefits. I'll be going over that a little bit more, as well as the specifics on the profiles and how they can help with cybersecurity practices. I'll also share and summarize the work that was done to develop the election infrastructure profile, which also includes some related work on the usability of the profiles. I'll briefly discuss the next profile on voter registration, and then talk about next steps overall. All right, so the cybersecurity framework has three main components. At the center of the framework and at the center of the slide, you'll see the cybersecurity framework core. It consists of three parts: the functions, categories, and subcategories. And here you'll see in the picture, it highlights the 5 functions: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Everything is framed under these 5 functions. And they're not only cybersecurity risk management terms, but they're also used as general risk management, business risk management terminology. So that kind of gets back to what Lisa was saying about, using common language that's meant to be easier to understand across all parties within an organization. Then on the left here, we have profiles, which provide a unique alignment of the organizational requirements and objectives, risk appetite, as well as resources against the desired outcomes of the framework core. And then implementation tiers. These are a qualitative measure of organizational cybersecurity risk management practices. These tiers can be used to guide organizations to consider the appropriate level of rigor for their cybersecurity program, and are often used as a communication tool to discuss risk appetite, mission priority, as well as budgets. So today we're going to focus on the profile component. And what do you need to develop a profile? Well, in the diagram here, we show the goals and business objectives, an understanding of your threat environment, and any additional requirements or policies. Those are all things that you take into consideration and can help guide you as you work through the development of profiles. With those in mind, you can gain an understanding of the desired outcomes, and that can help you reach those objectives and prioritize things accordingly. Profiles can be used to understand your current state of your cybersecurity posture, or you can also create a target profile, and that can be used to identify gaps between where you are and where you want to be. Like Lisa mentioned earlier, the cybersecurity framework can be used as that translation layer to communicate across multidisciplinary teams using non-technical language, and the profiles can help identify some of your specific priorities. So what's available right now is the draft NIST Interagency Report 8310, the Cybersecurity Framework Election Infrastructure Profile. It went out for public comment earlier this year, and the public comment is now closed, but we gathered and reviewed those comments, and we're currently updating that document for final. Thank you to all who took a look at that and provided feedback. What you'll find in that document is information about how we engage with election stakeholders for input. And we did that through workshops and follow-on meetings with election stakeholders. During those meetings, we identified and prioritized mission objectives, identified high priority categories for each mission objective, as well as the high priority subcategories for each mission objective. And we'll talk through a little bit more of that as we go through the slides. I want to share some specifics that you'll find within the profile for those who may not have seen it. So here is the list of the 10 mission objectives that came out of the workshop with the election stakeholders. They are also listed in the highest priority being at the top. You'll see here that the top 4 are conduct and oversee voting period activities, being number 1. Number 2, prepare and maintain election systems. Number 3, process and maintain voter registration. And then number 4, prepare for specific elections. Each mission objective also has a detailed description, and that includes some of the related activities and rationale for why it was included as a main mission objective. Walking through this process was important because it really helped shape the discussions that we had with the election stakeholders and the scope of what was included within a specific mission objective. For an election office, taking the time to identify and define mission objectives can not only be great for going through this profile process, but may also be beneficial in trying to share throughout your office to help your teams have a better understanding of your goals. Next up, we have category prioritization. Within the cybersecurity framework, there are 23 categories. The participants were given a list of the category descriptions, and one mission objective at a time, the participants ranked the categories that they felt fell under one of these options, one of these ranking options. So high being the most critical to getting the mission objective done, moderate to possibly high, meaning that it was important to the mission objective, but maybe not as important as the higher priority categories, and then moderate, which means they were prioritized as being necessary, but not with the same urgency as the other categories. Here is an example of what the category prioritization looks like for mission objective number 3, which is process and maintain voter registration system. In the high priority column, we have 2 categories, access control and data security. In the moderate to possibly high, we have 1 category, which is anomalies and event detection. And then under the moderate priority column, we have 2, which are response planning and recovery planning. Under each category are a set of subcategories. In total, the cybersecurity framework has 108 subcategories, and one mission objective at a time, the participants prioritize the subcategories, but the participants didn't necessarily go through all 108 for every single mission objective. They actually used the category prioritization that I showed previously to jump to specific sections for subcategory review. So for example, we saw 2 high priority areas in access control and data security. And so they would jump to that section and look at the subcategories there to do the prioritization. And so they were ranked using a dot or a circle system. 3 dots highlight the most critical subcategories that need to be addressed immediately to enable a mission objective. 2 dots means it could be as urgent as the 3 dots, but maybe only under certain circumstances, so they may not need to be addressed as immediately. And then 1 dot signifies the importance to the mission objective, but may not require the same urgency as the 2 or 3 dots. So in the end, these are all compiled into a final dot chart. And here's an excerpt of that dot chart showing the function, category, and subcategories. And the number of each mission objective is at the top of the chart. And so here you can see that the priorities vary per mission objective. So what might be a 3 dot for one mission objective is only a 1 dot for another. So just to recap a little bit, the draft NISTer 8310 is available. What I just went over is kind of what you'll find within the document, as well as that final dot chart that shows the prioritization for breakdown for all of the mission objectives that were discussed in the document. This profile could be used as an example example or reference profile, or as a baseline if you want to kind of compare it to see if there is any gaps or if you align with the same priorities. At the bottom of the slide here, I just kind of reiterate some of the potential uses or benefits, or a repeatable process to improve your cybersecurity posture, stronger communication due to that common language that you'll find within the framework core, flexible activities. The cybersecurity risk framework is flexible and can be tailored to your specific needs, and the opportunity to identify any gaps or other opportunities for improvement. So NIST worked with the Center for Tech and Civic Life to hold workshops to look into the usability of the cybersecurity framework profiles. This was important because we want to make sure that the profiles are usable, and so we reached out to folks from large, medium to small jurisdictions. We stepped through the profile development process and gathered information and feedback, and that was put into a form of recommendations for improving the usability of the profiles. Here's just a few examples of what we found. The first at the top, we have a recommendation to include to stress that both large and small election departments have been targets of cyber attacks, and to show brief case studies or news headlines to demonstrate the risk to small local election offices. And this is because during the workshops, some of the smaller local offices felt that they may not handle cybersecurity at this level. And that's more handled at the higher up at the state or maybe at another level, and so that they weren't involved in they wouldn't be involved in some of the profile work. And then the second one, I wanted to share a quote from one of the participants that says, "I've been part of a bunch of different cybersecurity initiatives, and they're very technical. So I appreciate that this is sort of a general overview with developing a plan on how to prioritize, as opposed to already assuming that you've got specific knowledge of what you want to do." Kind of speaking to the fact that, it is meant to be in a non-technical language and to help you prioritize and to develop your plan for your specific cybersecurity needs. So next up is the voter registration profile. Like Lisa mentioned, planning around this profile unfortunately aligned with the pandemic and the 2020 elections. So we didn't have the same in-person workshops or the same amount of participation that we had for the election infrastructure profile. And so we need to get additional feedback from election stakeholders, and that actually takes me right into our next steps. So what we plan to do is coordinate next steps for the voter registration profile with the DHS Cybersecurity Framework Joint Working Group, update these documents based on the public comments that we receive and publish them, and also incorporate the results and recommendations that we receive from the usability research. Something that we're thinking about is providing some additional informative references. Right now, the Cybersecurity Framework Core already points to things like the NIST Special Publication 853 controls. And so, maybe there's other more election-specific guidance that we could point to as well. And that is it for me. Any questions or thoughts on the profiles?
Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Gemma. Thank you for the briefing. I definitely think that the community can find a lot of value in this. I was wondering, do you have any queue of different election community topics to move on after voter registration?
We do not. Something that I wanted to mention was that, we picked voter registration definitely due to, when we did the election infrastructure profile, we saw that voter registration was in the top 4, as well as some of the events that happened around 2016. And, we definitely heard that that's an area that people would like more guidance in. And so that's how we picked voter registration as the next potential topic, as well as additional feedback from others, other election stakeholders. And so our hope was to get these out there, see what the feedback was on this, and then maybe get some guidance on are these profiles valuable? Would another one be useful? And if so, where would folks like to go next? I mean, we could certainly refer back to the top 4, but I think we'd be more interested in looking at that, as well as getting some additional feedback from the election community.
Thank you.
Sure.
Anyone else? Any other questions either for Gemma for this section? Or perhaps any comments before we get on to the last section of the meeting about other priorities that the TGDC wants to suggest?
Hi, this is Bob Giles. One of the things we've been talking about is electronic return. It's becoming initially we had talked about it for military and overseas voters, but it's becoming a bigger issue, especially for the disability community. And I'm just wondering where you guys are with that. I think it's something, I don't think it's something we can just stick our head in the sand and ignore because it's not 100% secure. I think we need to come up with some kind of standards or some kind of practice that is as secure as it can be right now. So I'm just wondering if you guys have been discussing that at all.
This is Gemma. I can speak to that, but I'll certainly turn it over to Lisa or anyone else on the NIST team if they want to add additional comments. So we're definitely aware of and definitely recognize that a lot of folks have interest in this area. And we're certainly thinking about it, especially from both the security and usability and accessibility aspects. And so we're looking into opportunities to update and improve some related guidance in that area that we have now, as well as any potential new work that or guidance that we could put out in this area. I don't have any specifics on what those next steps look like, but we're definitely thinking about that and thinking about where we can play a role and where we can provide additional guidance.
Thank you. I think it would be really helpful and a great opportunity for the EAC and NIST to really step up and take the lead on this. A lot of jurisdictions are being sued to comply with ADA for vote by mail. So accessible ballots being delivered to the voter, but also allowing voters to accessibly return them. And right now the process is they get them, even though they get to vote using their assistive device, they still have to print them out, put them in an envelope and return them. And that's where it changes from being accessible to no longer being completely accessible. So I think it's really critical, and I think the time is right. And I think there's enough public interest to really put this as a priority topic. So thank you.
Paul has his hand up.
And I just want to concur with Bob. If I heard, I was on another call yesterday with a different group, and if I understood what I heard there correctly, that a federal judge in North Carolina has already ordered this. If COVID brought us one thing as it relates to voting by mail, it was an expectation that there is going to be a huge push from the disability community for equal access that is accessible to them. Not just to receive ballots, but to also return them, which unfortunately, for the work Andrew and his team are doing with end-to-end means that, we're unfortunately 8 years too late getting there because the demand is going to be now, not later.
Hi, this is Chairman Palmer. Just following up on Bob and Paul's comments, I think that the whole ballot delivery issue is something that some states have a process to test that for usability testing and security and accessibility. And I think it's one of those areas in technology that the election system evaluation program can take a look at. We have prioritized electronic poll books. We're focused on that. But that not to prejudge what we might look at next. That could be the ballot delivery could be something that we engage in from a standard development and then testing of accessibility, usability, and obviously security of those systems. So I think that it's on our radar, but not to prejudge, but I think it's very possible that that could be something that we look at and try to create a uniform level of security for these systems for security and accessibility.
Well, and as I mentioned on the call I was on yesterday, we're not talking about, we all understand, right? There's layers of this. So up here is the completely unsecure, just attach to an email and send it to me, right? We all agree that's bad. Can we find a place down here where we say, well, it's not as secure as down here would be, but it's better than being up here. So it's going to become to my estimation, a layer of degrees of security where eventually we're going to have to settle on an acceptable degree of risk, which will end up driving the conversation because, sorry, we can't help you, isn't going to fly when the federal judge pushes the order down and says, do this.
No, Paul, I agree with that. I do think that particularly with ballot delivery, it's required under, not only is it required under federal law, state law, but in many cases for voters with disabilities, it could be required by judicial decree, and states are under the gun to make it work from a number of different angles. Ballot return is a little bit more trickier. There's not the federal requirement for those for voters. And obviously, in some cases, even with these judicial decrees, they don't necessarily require ballot return. But I think, from my perspective as a commissioner, I want to be helpful to the community where there is a requirement to do so or a desire to deliver ballots, and that we all feel comfortable with that there's a certain level of security and testing of those systems. And it may not please everybody, but there's a lot of systems out there that have no one really looking at it. There are no standards. And in some cases, these systems are required under federal law and judicial decree. And so for there not to be any sort of regimented process is really an abdication of duty. And from my perspective, and so for at least those that are required under, like you mentioned, I think that that is something I've been thinking about. I know the team has. Down the road, it could be something that we start looking at the technology and what those standards would be, and then how do we test those?
Well, and I just think the imperative will come sooner than any of us would like, from that standpoint. But I believe one of the phrases used in that judicial decision in North Carolina was that requiring the disability community to have a printer would equate to effectively a poll tax, which, so find a way to do it that doesn't require them to have a printer becomes the imperative from the court system.
This is Diane, and I'll just say I appreciate the discussion. And yeah, there's actually a rather organized effort among disability advocacy organizations, especially the major blind organizations and Paralyzed Vet United Spinal folks with significant physical motor disabilities, to ensure that quote unquote absentee vote by mail, whatever it's called, is not just either mailing a paper ballot that has to be hand marked and mailed back, or blank digital ballot delivery that has to be printed and returned in hard copy, which again throws accessibility out the window. One of the challenges that and you're absolutely correct, these cases, and ACB has a lot of data on how many states have actually they've been leading a lot of the litigation, and there's a number of states, and the legal precedents are really stacking up. So it's going to be a little tough to probably turn that train around. But one of the issues that has come up is the difference between the massive term disability, ADA covered people with disabilities, which is a whole lot of different things, versus a group of people called print disabled, which is a subset of the universe of people with disabilities. And it is those folks who cannot use print on paper and or handle paper, basically. So it'll be interesting, and I'm saying this a little bit for the election officials information, because it may very well be that you're in it's an awkward position if indeed you allow digital ballot return for a select group of voters, aka UOCAVA voters and voters with disabilities. Is it voters with disabilities the big group, or is it the smaller group of people with print disabilities? And is it self-attestation or whatever? There's probably going to be some interesting legal discussions that come out of that.
Thank you. Any other discussions or comments on this discussion, or anything else that anyone would like to bring up this time?
Yeah, there is one other issue, Chair.
Sure.
I wanted to talk a little bit about Diane Golden, your comment earlier. It's somewhat related to what you said. You made a comment that some of the older machines are not as accessible, and there's hope in VBSG 2.0, and that we could find ourselves in a position where we have older systems for a long period of time, and manufacturers don't necessarily build the 2.0. One of the messages that I've been sending is that there's only, the manufacturers listen primarily to local election officials. They also listen to other stakeholders, like at the state level. I'm sure we have, the EAC can do some things, NIST. But the reality of it is they primarily listen to local election officials who want to buy new systems or want the new technology. I think a good case for some of the products that we have now is, I know there was many members of the community with voters with disabilities, advocating for voters with disabilities, had conversations with the manufacturers that we need to do better. We need to have new products. And in some ways they responded, maybe not adequately, but they responded with some new products. My point is that the Congress, there are other ways to incentivize manufacturers. The promise of state, local, or federal resources is one, but also they do listen to some extent to the election community and to other stakeholders that, look, we really need this technology from a security perspective. We really need it from an accessibility perspective. We need you to design it, and then we have to find the wherewithal the resources for the localities to procure those systems. But I just wanted to take this opportunity to talk about that. We don't want to be in the same situation as 1.1. We don't want to have only 1.0 systems in the field. We want there to be 2.0 systems in the field. So we all sort of have to find a way to influence the manufacturers to design and build, and to those folks who handle the resources, so there's adequate resources for localities to purchase those systems. So there's an incentive, there's incentives in this market, in this program. Otherwise, we lose the promise of 2.0. So I just wanted to make those comments and put it out there for discussion.
Commissioner Palmer?
Yes.
Thank you. All right, if there's no further discussion, then we'll move on to the last set of presentations for the day. We're going to hear about progress made on the Promoting Access to Voting executive order. I believe we're going to hear from Carrie Ann Buchanan and Kevin Mangold from NIST for this. So Carrie Ann or Kevin?
Thank you, Jim. Carrie Ann, can you share the slides? If you're able to. All right, thank you everyone for the opportunity to give you guys an update on our progress for our response to the Executive Order 14019, promoting access to voting for people with disabilities. Next slide. So Carrie Ann and I are the lead authors. However, all the work involved requires a much larger team. So this is a list of folks who have spent a lot of their time over the past 8 months helping with our response. Next slide. So in the section 7 of the EO, NIST was called out to look at barriers that voters with disabilities face, specifically voter registration and the National Mail Voter Registration Form, voting by mail, voting technology, polling locations, poll worker training, and any other areas that we identified throughout our research process. Next slide. So the EO came out in March. From March through July was more our research period. We read a lot of papers, reports, news articles. We talked with, I think, just shy of about 50 stakeholders and got their feedback, asked them questions about barriers that they've seen, and tried to brainstorm some ways to kind of overcome those barriers so that we could include actual recommendations in our report that have been tried and proven to work well. And then in June, we put out an RFI, request for information, and we got 171 responses, giving us additional feedback on barriers that voters face all across the country. And as Lisa said earlier, we're really, really close to getting our public comment draft out. So once that's published, it'll be out for 30 days. And then we will incorporate all that feedback into the draft. And then we're still on target for our December 2nd due date. Next slide.
I can take it from here. So in talking more about our RFI, we received 171 relevant responses. We received responses from a wide variety of different individuals and groups. 46 different advocacy groups and associations left responses. We also heard from other organizations as well, including 3 voting technology vendors, 1 professional society, and 1 policy institute. We also heard from some government agencies as well, both at the, or I guess at the federal level, state and local level. And really though, the largest group of responses that we heard was from individuals commenting themselves. And really largely these voters were people with disabilities or caregivers of voters with disabilities responding to the questions that we had posted in the Federal Register. So giving you a bit of an overview of what we heard in the RFI, we were able to synthesize the responses into 5 main themes. The first being that privacy, independence, and equal access are of utmost importance to voters with disabilities. And we think this really comes across given that over 100 people with disabilities directly commented on these topics. So that really speaks to how important this issue is. The second theme we found was that many barriers exist for voters across a wide range of disabilities. We heard from voters who were blind, voters with cognitive and intellectual disabilities, and many, many other disabilities as well. So these issues aren't really just affecting one group or one specific type of individual. These things really extend across a variety of different people and a variety of different needs. We also found that in terms of recommendations that people had in the responses, that more choices might mean more accessibility and also just better design for voters in general. So having more accessible choices and accessible options might mean that people can choose the option that might work best for their needs. We also received feedback that multiple standards, laws, and guidelines and best practices currently do exist that increase accessibility in the voting process. The issue is that these things are not evenly implemented across the country. So raising awareness that these things exist and having recommendations for how these things can be better applied is needed. Another theme that we found is that both accessibility and cybersecurity are needed in the voting process, and that these two different domains must work together so that solutions for voting are both accessible and also secure. So given the RFI responses, as well as all of the other work that went into collecting information to respond to the executive order, we went ahead and drafted our report. So here's an overview of that structure of that draft report that you'll see going out for public comment very soon. So we start with the introduction, but the first major section that we have in the report are systemic barriers to and recommendations for voting accessibility. Across the work that we've done, we realized that there were some systemic barriers that really go across the voting process that we should describe up front, as well as recommendations that can be made that address these barriers that are more systemic, as well as can address some of the barriers across different aspects of the voting process. Sections 3 through 7 of the report then describe the specific areas of voting that are called out in that executive order. So for each of these sections, we describe the barriers that voters with disabilities may face in that particular area, as well as some specific recommendations that can be made to overcome barriers within that particular area. So we are really excited for you to read and see the report. Rather than going through all of the many barriers and recommendations that we have in the report, we can give you a flavor for the content of the report by telling you a little bit more about section 2, those systemic barriers and recommendations. So in the draft report, we've identified 5 systemic barriers. The first is struggles to meet federal standards, laws, and guidelines that address accessibility for voters. So here we describe ADA, which we've already talked about a little bit today, as well as the VBSG. Another barrier that we found was gaps in accessible communication and information in terms of how voters are learning about the voting process, partaking in the voting process, and getting their questions answered that they need. Another systemic barrier for voters with disabilities can be paper, especially for those with print disabilities, as Diane Golden just described. This is a specific challenge for them. Another barrier is that people with disabilities face challenges when the design of security solutions don't consider accessibility in the design. And the final systemic barrier we identified are extra obstacles encountered by voters with disabilities. For example, many voters experience stigma by nature of how the polling places can be set up in some instances. Other times there's a lot of time and planning that can go into going into voting in the first place and having to manage transportation to actually get to the polls. So there's a lot of obstacles that can result in significant barriers that prevent people from privately and independently voting. So to address these systematic barriers, we have also identified 5 systemic recommendations in the draft report. The first being to create guidance to help address meeting federal standards, laws, and guidelines. And part of this recommendation includes a holistic, multi-agency working group that can meet to discuss some of these issues. Another recommendation is to improve dissemination, outreach, and accessibility of voting information so that voters are able to understand more about the voting process, as well as the accessible options that they can use when they're voting. The third recommendation is to provide accessible options for the voting process. So having options to choose for, from registering to vote, to voting in person, to also voting in mail. Again, echoing what we found in the RFI, having different options for achieving different parts of this process is really important for addressing as many needs of voters with disabilities as we can. Another recommendation is to integrate the disability community into all aspects of voting. For example, this can include establishing formal partnerships with disability and advocacy groups at the state and local level. And our final recommendation is to conduct research and development to promote access to voting. So here we make recommendations for how technology currently can be developed to help voters with disabilities throughout the voting process. We also discuss how some future research is needed, especially, for example, as we talked about today, aspects such as electronic return could be something where more research is needed to make voting both secure but also accessible for voters with disabilities. So the next steps for us is to now go out for public comment. As Kevin mentioned, we're really hoping that the public comment period will open very, very soon, and that'll be open for 30 days. So we definitely invite you all to see our announcement and how to comment in both the Federal Register or on this voting webpage. So next steps for this group, though, is we really want to hear from you on these topics. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the content that we've put together in the draft report. We do encourage you as well to share the draft report with as many different individuals, stakeholder groups, and any group that this would be relevant to as possible. As we've talked about throughout this meeting, this part of the process is really important to us to get as much feedback as possible. So we definitely invite you to do that. We're also happy to have conversations about this as well. So please feel free to reach out to us if you'd want to talk about the draft. Thank you again so much for your time today. As Lisa said at the beginning, we're really excited about this. We're really excited for the public comment period to make the draft much stronger, so it can have as much impact as we can to help people with disabilities when this report is published in December. I'll go ahead and open it up to questions now.
Thanks. Any questions for Carrie Ann or Kevin? All right. Well, thank you. That was a good presentation. Appreciate the progress being made on that. The response to the short timelines. All right. Well, that we have reached the end of the agenda. I want to thank everybody for your contributions. Your comments and insights are very valuable to all of us. So appreciate very much your dedication to the process and the time we spent today. Thanks to all the presenters. Really good job staying on time. Obviously, we're ending early, so that's good for everyone. If things go as we would hope, I will only get to chair one of these meetings, as much as a pleasure as it's been to be here today. The nominee to be the next NIST director is Dr. Lori Locascio, and her hearing is scheduled for later this month. So if things go very well, she will be chairing the next meeting that you have. I have a sense that this group would do really well with an in-person meeting, and that the conversations would continue long after the official meeting ended and things like that. So Commissioner Palmer, did you want to talk about when your next meeting might be?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I would love to have, it's open to you all. I think that I don't think we need to go another year for our next meeting. I think that could be every 6 months or more. I was thinking maybe sometime prior to the regular April, May meetings of the other boards might be something that we look at. So I'm going to throw out March of 22 for another meeting to pencil in. One other issue to consider is I think that we're open to have more meetings, either formally and informally. I think that the NIST work on the executive order will be very interesting, because it's looking at a lot of technology solutions in the voting process for voters with disabilities. And so if there's a desire to have one later in this year, that's please let me know. We can work with NIST on that. Unless we hear from that, I think we probably schedule a March 22, and I'll just open it up for any discussions before we get off for the meeting. Any input on that? So we're going to look at March then, and okay, we do have one, Janelle Cannon. Hello.
Janelle, we can see your hand is raised, but can't hear you.
I can't hear. Ms. Cannon, can you hear me now?
She is unmuted, but I'm not sure what's going on her end.
So we can talk offline. Unless there's any objection, we'll look at March, and if there's any impetus to do something earlier, we can start that discussion. Don't hesitate to reach out to me or John Panic or the NIST team, and we can talk about an earlier date if we want to get a specific briefing on some of the executive order recommendations. Thank you. And Chairman Althop, did you have any closing comments?
Nope, just I wanted to thank you for your engagement. I appreciate it very much. Wanted to know if you had anything that you wanted to add to the meeting before we call it a close.
Thank you, sir. I don't have anything further.
All right, well then, thank you, everyone. We appreciate your engagement. Have a good rest of the day. And I guess we see you at the next meeting.